Good afternoon. I'm Jean Feraca. We're going to talk about a great American this afternoon, a Scottish American who lived in Wisconsin, as most great environmentalists did. John Muir. He's known as the father of our national parks and was largely responsible for the establishment of the Yosemite, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, Mount Rainier, Petrified Forest, and other national parks and monuments. He was instrumental in influencing Presidents Cleveland and Theodore Roosevelt to establish millions of acres of forest reserves, leading to the establishment of the National Forest System. Historians recognize that no one has had more influence on the modern conservation movement than John Muir. The year 1988 marks the 150th anniversary of his birth. More about that later. John Muir was also the founding president of the Sierra Club, an organization which has helped make the United States a leader in the global environmental movement. As first president of the Sierra Club, John Muir was largely responsible for launching the modern wilderness preservation movement. The past few years have witnessed an explosion of interest in John Muir, including the publication of at least 4 major biographies and several new anthologies of his writing. Despite his death more than 70 years ago, and he died, by the way, on Christmas Eve, the night historically when the animals talk, Muir holds a preeminent spot in the hearts and minds of many Americans. John Muir credited his boyhood homestead, known as Fountain Lake Farm in rural Montello, Wisconsin, as having had the greatest influence on his personal evolution and as the place where he first conceived the idea of our national park system. And our guest this afternoon is landscape architect Erik Brynildson, who can speak with a great deal of intimacy about that piece of property, since for the last year he has owned it. Special privileged character that you are, Erik Brynildson.
Thank you. It is certainly a special privilege, as you said. A lot of the landscape that is currently there is much like it was when Muir's were there. My alarm clock from at least the third week of March through October is the sandhill cranes bugling in the sedge meadow or Muir's garden meadow just below the house.
Now, when you say that, I suspect that a lot of people automatically think of not John Muir, but Aldo Leopold. Let's get the connection between these two giants clear right at the start.
There's a lot of connections between the two Wisconsin naturalists. Muir certainly was a great influence to Aldo Leopold, and throughout Leopold's writings, Muir is mentioned. In fact, my friend and colleague Kurt Miney, who is now has just completed the latest biography on Aldo Leopold, which will be released next month, came across while he was doing his archival research a letter written by Aldo Leopold that was dated just exactly 1 week before Leopold's death in April of 1948. Leopold was urging his fellow conservationists at the time, people like Norman Fassett, John Curtis, and others, to do something about buying up the Muir Fountain Lake Farm and restoring it back to a pre-settlement condition.
And when you came into ownership of the property, it was in a bad state of deterioration and neglect, wasn't it?
It was. The site that I own consists of 17.5 acres. It's the only portion of the original Muir farm that's not now publicly owned. Other parts of the farm are designated as a state scientific area, which would include the very high quality and diverse sedge meadow that's below my house, that's currently a state scientific area. And the rest of it then is deeded to Marquette County as the only county park in that county. When I purchased the property, much of the land was a dense thicket of black locust trees, and the rest of it was a very thick stand of red pines. It was a plantation. And since I've owned it, I have clear-cut the stand of red pines, and the site basically this year was prepared for prairie seeding next spring in honor of Muir's 150th birthday.
When John Muir credited this boyhood home as being one of the major influences in his evolution as a great naturalist, what do you think he meant by that?
I suggest to people when they ask me that question to pick up a copy of The Story of My Boyhood and Youth, which is the autobiography that was published less than a year before Muir's death. And it certainly shows that right up until the time Muir died, he credited the farm with being the most influential place in terms of his evolution as a naturalist. In other words, the experiences he had there during those impressionable boyhood years, some experiences were very negative ones. He had a father that was a very fanatical Calvinist religious zealot, we'll say, and he took to beating his three boys, or thrashing them, as John Muir called it, almost daily, whether or not they needed it or not, is what words that Muir used. For instance, Muir and his brothers would often burn piles of brush as they were clearing the farm. And while they did that, Daniel Muir, John's father, would stand over them and say, imagine that as the fires of hell, and this is what will happen to you. You'll be thrown in there if you don't obey the scriptures and that sort of thing. And Daniel Muir was not much of a farmer himself. He relied mostly on his daughters, his wife, and his three sons to take care of the farm chores. And
were they any more skilled as farmers than he?
None of the Muirs had a rural farming background. John's first 11 years were spent in Dunbar, Scotland. In town, in Dunbar, his father Daniel was in the storekeeping business, and his second wife was the heiress to quite a lucrative dry goods business in Dunbar. And so when Daniel Muir immigrated to Wisconsin, he was really, by immigrant standards, quite wealthy and had much more to do in terms of homesteading. He had a big advantage over many of the Irish-Scotch immigrants up there.
Francis Hammerstrom, with whom I consulted in preparing for this program, says that many naturalists had a great many children who were unhappy in their early years, grew up to be great naturalists. Is that true in John Muir's case?
I think it is, and I would agree with Francis on that comment. I think that if we look at some of the great naturalists and go beyond that in terms of the nature writers and poets and so on, that either they suffered the feeling of being different, or loners, we'll say, perhaps even a lonely sort of childhood. Others maybe were stricken by tragedy of some kind, whether it be personal health problems or family problems or whatever. And certainly in John Muir's case, his father, that was a very unloving, sort of authoritarian dictator almost of a father, I think no doubt had a great deal to do with Muir's rebellion against popularized Judeo-Christian religion, we'll say, versus his mystical spirituality, as he called it. He said there was a clear difference, in other words, between popular religion as it's practiced, say, by Christians, versus being spiritual and being holistic and one with nature. And he could see God clearest in nature, in the grandeur of snow-capped mountains, or the beauty in the orchids in the Fountain Lake Meadow, or whatever.
Okay. So the wilderness, in a sense, becomes an alternate father and mother.
I would agree with that.
An alternate nurturer that takes on the nurturing of the child when the parents, for one reason or other, become very forbidding and stern.
I think that's true. I think it becomes sort of a place of refugia, a place of solace and reflection, and a place where Muir certainly could go to really figure out just who he was as a person.
What kind of animals were found on Fountain Lake?
Well, it's interesting. The passenger pigeon certainly adorned the skies of Fountain Lake Farm when John Muir was living there, and it's interesting that the last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo in September of 1914, just a few months before John Muir passed away on Christmas Eve of that year. Other animal components of the landscape, zoological components of the landscape that are now absent from Fountain Lake Farm would include the prairie chicken. I personally, along with the restoration of the site, would like to see little population pockets of prairie chickens reintroduced throughout the Central Sands counties. I think that there's enough habitat there where we could start trying those sorts of things. He also writes, of course, of species of birds that are still there, the more common ones like blue jays. When he and his brother David first got off the wagon from Kingston and laid eyes on Fountain Lake Farm, or the environs there, for the first time, they quickly climbed a tree and discovered a blue jay's nest. And he writes about other animals such as deer that are, of course, still there, even in higher numbers today. and then the typical woodland squirrels, rabbits.
Did he make any wild pets?
Yes, he made quite a few wild pets. The one I'm going to use as an example would be when he was a child, he had the urge to, like a lot of young rural boys growing up, they have the urge to shoot things and reduce things to possession, and he had a special affinity to shoot a loon. And he walked down to Fountain Lake one day and did see a loon on the water and shot it and winged it and stunned the bird, and he was able to capture it and bring it up into the Burr Oak shanty. And the bird, they had a cat in the shanty, and the loon, the cat got too close to the loon, and the loon pecked the cat in right in the forehead with the loons have a very powerful beak. And it sent the cat running to and fro all over the shanty, screaming. And so, yes, he did have pet animals. He also regularly fed the prairie chickens in the winter when food was low. They would come up around the shanty and later the farmhouse, and he talks about taking corn and so on out for them.
How did they heat the house?
The house was heated with a small box stove that took very small firewood pieces, in other words, sticks, maybe up to 16, 18 inches long at the most. So you couldn't get a real roaring fire going, and he also wrote of how cold it was in the house and how they would get chilblain and wake up in the morning with coats frozen to their faces, and even having three brothers in the same bed, they would wake up with their boots covered with ice upstairs, and again, their coats frozen to their faces. So it certainly didn't heat the house appropriately. Just the kitchen was warm.
Did it fall to the boys to have to gather the firewood?
It certainly did. Dan Muir was busy as a lay preacher. There's a small church not too far from Fountain Lake Farm that still stands where Mr. Muir, Daniel Muir, later preached. This was starting in 1865. And Daniel Muir, again, was basically going around to different houses where they had church meetings at that time, and was known as a preacher who didn't particularly enjoy farming.
Dan Muir being the father.
And that's correct.
Did the boys have a lot of chores, and John in particular, that he felt interfered with his ambition to be a naturalist?
He had, from the very start, he had the feeling that clearing the land, cutting down the big bur oaks and shagbark hickories and white oaks and so on that comprised the savanna area there, and plowing up the prairie, this virgin prairie and so on, was wrong. He felt that people spent far too much time working and disrupting nature just to make a living, rather than to live closer to nature in a holistic way.
Well, there comes the conflict between the Judeo-Christian ethic that he inherited from his father's Calvinist tradition and the one that he developed himself internally.
All his life he recognized that the Judeo-Christian dominionistic land ethic, if you will, where man or people have dominion or mastery over all other living things, including the living landscape itself, was wrong. He thought that the Bible was certainly a chief reason for the separation of people and land, and that it taught rather than a sense of stewardship and husbandry and some sort of a loving land ethic, it taught just the opposite.
Mm-hmm. You speak about, let me see if I can get the exact quote here. You speak about the interconnection of all of these divergent biotic communities. Now that's a Leopold term, really. Mm-hmm. But when John Muir was 17, his father Daniel purchased more land. The fragile sandy soils of Fountain Lake Farm gave out under the intensive growing of winter wheat. And in a chain of sequences somewhat like that of the house that Jack built, the Muirs had felled the trees that homed the birds that would have eaten the larvae that grew into the bugs that ate the wheat.
Exactly.
And as John later learned, everything is hitched to everything else. Well, that's a very, very, for us, new notion of this interconnectedness of things. That although Leopold, who, as I understand it, was not really the father, well, if he was the father of modern ecological thinking, then John Muir was really the grandfather. But Leopold is credited with that original idea. And actually, you're saying that John Muir was the one who originated it.
Leopold first used the term ecology. It's my understanding, at least, that he first coined that term. He's known as the father of wildlife management. I think, and by Leopold's own admission, Muir was a big influence and one of Leopold's favorites all through his life. And there's just a short part of the essay from Leopold's Sac County Almanac entitled "The Good Oak," where Leopold is sawing through a felled oak, a storm casualty, and as he saws, he gives us in ring by ring chronology a history of that tree and some of the cultural things that were taking place at the time of each that he severs each ring. I'd like to read just a short paragraph from that essay. The saw now severs 1865, the pith year of our oak. In that year, John Muir offered to buy from his brother, who then owned the home farm 30 miles east of my oak, a sanctuary for the wild flowers that had gladdened his youth. His brother declined to part with the land, but he could not suppress the idea. 1865 still stands in Wisconsin history as the birth year of mercy for things natural, wild, and free. We have this connection again between the two. Really, in terms between the two naturalists, Muir and Leopold. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure who we should say was first at anything. I think that if we read even prior to Muir, some of the great Native American Indian chiefs were writing eloquent, beautiful essays about
writing them down.
Actually, writing them down or being recorded in some manner. Yes, writing them down. I think about the connections, interconnections, the interdependence, and interdependencies in all nature, this holistic, this circular flow found in nature rather than separateness. I personally give credit to the Native Americans most of the time for first conceiving this idea of everything is connected to everything else, and that really we do live on one flowing planet rather than something that's segmented and truncated.
How do you account for the emergence of that idea in the minds of the two great naturalist thinkers of this century?
Both men experienced evolutions in their own attitudes towards nature. Muir started out in childhood with sort of a killer lust, or as Leopold called it, say a triggeritis. In other words, he would shoot anything he could, and he, especially being influenced as a young boy by his father, certainly was
taking out the anger,
and certainly forced to view nature in a more utilitarian way. I suppose the closest analog I could find with Leopold would be just the moment he realized after shooting the wolf, in the mountains of the Southwest, and watching the great green fire of the eyes of the wolf die. At that time, he knew the lesson of the kebab and all that predators, by eliminating predators, it really wasn't going to help the deer and create a healthy deer herd. I think that Leopold, throughout his life too, became much more of an interpreter of nature, a field naturalist, ecologist in the best sense of that word. Rather, when he was younger and starting out, he was, I think, much more of a game manager in the definition of that word versus an ecologist. And I think there's a real difference between the two.
Okay. My guest this afternoon is landscape architect Erik Brynildson, who owns and is restoring the property of the boyhood home of John Muir. And we look forward to celebrating the 150th anniversary of is it the birth of John Muir?
The birthday of Muir, yeah.
The birthday of Muir, which will be celebrated on April the 21st, 1988. It's interesting because these years back to back, this has been the 100th anniversary of Leopold's birth. And next year will begin the 150th anniversary of Muir. Leopold has been well celebrated this year, much fanfare and to-do. Not much about Muir, and we're going to hear more about that in just a moment. I invite your participation in this program. Call us at 263-1890 if you're listening locally in Madison or Milwaukee. Back with Erik Brynildson. And we left off saying that we were anticipating the 150th celebration of the birthday of John Muir on April the 21st, 1988. Why is it that Muir, unlike Leopold, has actually been more highly touted in other states in this country, like California, for example, than in his native Wisconsin, do you think?
I would say, Gene, that Leopold, when he came here in the early 1930s and the university founded the chair of game management for him, which created what's now the Department of Wildlife Ecology on campus. He came here at pretty much the apex, the heart of his career, and was very, very active in the state throughout the rest of his life. He simply spent more years here, and especially his productive years as an ecologist, conservationist advocate. Versus Muir, who spent, again, the boyhood years here, and then later went off where he became famous in California and also famous in Alaska for the Harriman expedition and his studies on glaciers there. I would say that's the biggest reason. I don't think too many Wisconsinites realize that, again, by Muir's own admission, that the Fountain Lake Farm environs played the most influential or formative role of any place that he lived. It's interesting that our present National Historic Site honoring John Muir at Martinez, California, is really a product of his marriage to Louise Strenzel, who he married at the age of 42, the daughter of a Polish immigrant surgeon. And it's not a Muir-built environment in the vernacular sense, like Fountain Lake Farm was. So I think this is a golden opportunity for Wisconsin to recognize Muir as one of the state's great conservationists with Leopold and others. And California is ahead of us on this. The California legislature now has before them a resolution which I personally drafted in Estes Park, Colorado, in September at the Fourth World Wilderness Congress Symposium, and that was unanimously adopted there. It's since been sent to the California legislature, where I believe it's going to go through, and we're trying to do the same thing then in Wisconsin, so that he does get recognized here for the importance of Wisconsin in his life.
Now, there are specific proposals part of this. One is part of it is to create a postal stamp in his commemorative stamp, and there are other items.
One is the designation of the Fountain Lake Farm itself as a National Historic Site. I've been having meetings and correspondence with National Park Service officials, including William Penn Mott, who's the present director, who's also a landscape architect. And everything seems very favorable, that the Park Service is quite excited about the project. And this coming Tuesday night, I have a meeting before the Marquette County Board where they're going to be considering the resolution, and hopefully it will be passed by the Marquette County Board of Supervisors at their January meeting.
You know, it occurs to me, in a sense, I mean, these things are very nice. We create a commemorative stamp, and we create a park out of the boyhood property, and we create an official national recognition day on the anniversary of his birth. But in a way, isn't all this tokenism? I mean, how can you really get people to appreciate and absorb the thinking, which is very revolutionary thinking for us? How can you give them the kind of experience that you must be having living there? I mean, it must be changing you.
Yeah, it certainly has. I'm not sure that you can give them that type of very personal experience, really, a very intimate one. But I do think that tokenism, if we can call it that, is appropriate in honoring the nation's great conservationists, whether it be Leopold, who we honored this year in terms of his centennial anniversary, and John Burroughs, by the way. It was his 150th anniversary of his birth in 1987. Not too many of us in Wisconsin heard about that. There was some local celebration along the Hudson River Valley where he lived in the Catskills. And then, of course, Muir next year. I think that as conservationists that we can use this kind of thing to rally around, to build enthusiasm among the masses for present-day conservation issues, and they're becoming more and more of a global scale all the time. And I would say that sort of value is paramount here, and I think that there's something too to be said for using history as the foundation of present-day ecological problem solving.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that too often in scientific approaches that the element of history is forgotten, or people are oblivious to it, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn by studying whether it be the Hetch Hetchy Dam controversy that took place shortly before Muir's death in 1912, 1913. We can look at that case and learn from it, hopefully, and many, many other cases as well. We can still learn from Leopold's KBAB experiment in the Southwest as to our attitudes towards the reintroduction of the wolf, say, in Wisconsin. You find that a lot of this stuff has happened before, and that history really does repeat itself, and there's much to learn from it.
When the Muirs came to Marquette County, what was the year?
1849, the spring of 1849.
It must have been very different then. It was a pioneer Wisconsin that they were coming to.
Muir writes about coming across the prairies in the spring, very muddy, being pulled by a team of oxen in a wagon. Coming from Milwaukee, they arrived at Milwaukee from Ellis Island, New York, by steamer. And really what brought them to Marquette County is that while they were in New York, they heard that most of the wheat that was being shipped to New York was coming from that region in Wisconsin. So they decided to settle there rather than Canada, which was the initial hope of Dan Muir, or intent of Dan Muir.
Mm. Now, isn't that interesting that the wheat would have been coming from Marquette County, which was one of the sand counties, having even then, I would presume, a rather fragile soil.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And a lot of those early wheat farms didn't last long, and the classic case here would be the Fountain Lake Farm. It only went about 7 or 8 growing seasons, really, under wheat, and the fragile soils did really burn out.
So the Sand County farm that Aldo Leopold inherited, which was rich in his imagination because it was so impoverished,
exactly,
was really the kind of farm that he might have just as well have inherited from the Muir property, from the Muir estate. I mean, that was the prototype of what Leopold took on.
Both the shack in Sauk, right on the Sauk and Columbia County line, or the Fountain Lake Farm in Marquette County, south central Marquette County, are within the district of the Sands, or the Sand Counties. So they decided to settle there rather than Canada, which was the initial hope of Dan Muir, or intent of Dan Muir.
Now, isn't that interesting that the wheat would have been coming from Marquette County, which was one of the sand counties, having even then, I would presume, a rather fragile soil?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And a lot of those early wheat farms didn't last long, and the classic case here would be the Fountain Lake Farm. It only went about 7 or 8 growing seasons, really, under wheat, and the fragile soils did really burn out.
So the Sand County farm that Aldo Leopold inherited, which was rich in his imagination because it was so impoverished,
exactly,
was really the kind of farm that he might have just as well have inherited from the Muir property, from the Muir estate. I mean, that was the prototype of what Leopold took on.
Both the shack in Sauk, right on the Sauk and Columbia County line, or the Fountain Lake Farm in Marquette County, south central Marquette County, are within the district of the Sands, or the Sand Counties. And Leopold came to call that area poor land but rich country. He said that the sand was capable of growing a lot more than corn, that it could reap high bushel yields of things like perception and a love of landscape and understanding and sensitivity toward nature. So the sand, really, as I see it now living there, is perhaps the key to the salvation of the wildness of the sand counties. It's simply harder to fill a silo in sand, and so because it isn't really fertile farming country, lots of the wild elements of the landscape, like crane marshes and adjacent sedge meadows to the Fox River and so on and so forth, are still intact for the most part. And if we look at, say, the southwestern part of the state, where you find corn planted barbed wire to barbed wire and so on, where there's really little farm wildlife habitat such as fence rows and so that kind of thing left, it's a nice contrast. It is certainly economically, Marquette County as well as all the Sand counties are economically depressed. They're poverty-stricken or poor in that sense, but yet they're very rich in their natural diversity and beauty.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a Milwaukee caller. Hi, you're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon. Your guest mentioned a short time ago the Hetch-Hetchy Dam controversy, and I must admit that I've read not a great deal about it, although I understand it was an environmental catastrophe of some scope, especially at that time. And so I have a two-part question. One, could he at least briefly describe that controversy and what its significance was to environmental mistakes in America? And secondly, is it true, is there any truth to the legend that Muir losing the battle over Hetch-Hetchy in some sense led to his death? And I'll just listen on the radio.
Thanks for the question.
Well, both good questions. I'll start out then by explaining really what Hetch-Hetchy was. It involved the damming and flooding of Hetch-Hetchy Valley within Yosemite National Park, which is a park that Muir was instrumental in creating. The Hetch-Hetchy Dam project it does exist. As you know, it was lost. Environmentalists or John Muir personally lost that battle, and it was the last major battle he fought before his death. But Hetch-Hetchy at one time was a primary source of water for the city of San Francisco. It no longer is considered to be a primary source, and in fact there is a local, San Francisco Sierra Club advocate. He's, I think, an attorney that has proposed that the Hetch-Hetchy Dam be blown out and that the valley be restored back to its original condition in honor of 1988, Muir's 150th anniversary. Now, I don't know where that project stands at this time, but I know it is an idea that's being talked about in San Francisco. Then, finally, your second part of the question, how much impact did it have on the death of Muir in 1914? Most of the biographers that have researched intimately and thoroughly John Muir's life conclude that the Hetch-Hetchy experience, the loss of that battle, indeed did shorten his life, and it did cause him a lot of emotional stress, and he did fall to ill health and sort of a period of recluseness, we'll say, after the battle was lost. So I would agree, too, in my studies it seems to point that loss really did have an impact on his life.
Anybody else with a good question can call us at 263-1890 if you're listening in Madison or Milwaukee. Otherwise, dial 1-800-642-1234 anywhere else in the state of Wisconsin. My guest this afternoon is landscape architect Erik Brynildson, owner and restorer of Fountain Lake Farm, the boyhood home of the great conservationist John Muir. I'm Jean Feraca, and this is Wisconsin Public Radio. Coming up later in today's show, commentator Justin Isherwood contemplates nature, Madison Avenue style. And today on All Things Considered, a report on Secretary of State Schultz's post-summit meeting with the NATO alliance. Also, a visit to Marion Prison, where tight security measures have come under fire from Amnesty International and other prison watch organizations. That's beginning here on Wisconsin Public Radio at 4 o'clock. Erik, what are some of your pet projects in restoring the property?
It's my goal, Jean, to restore the property back to an approximate aura that the Muirs would have experienced while they were living there. And when I say that, I'm not saying their crop or field patterns, but more of a pre-settlement condition, what the landscape looked like at the time of their arrival in the spring of 1849.
Why is that important?
I think that, again, it's in the same sense as the Arboretum, it's important that we have bits and pieces, and that's about all they are anymore, of native pre-settlement landscape for a barometer, for something to compare to in terms of present land use patterns. I think that they're a rich living library in terms of their historical significance, and they also afford us a lot of values in terms of their scientific and educational opportunities. And it's also what I'm doing right now. It's funny. It was a dream of John Muir to restore the old farm after he did settle in California and became famous and wealthy and all that. He tried to buy parts of the Fountain Lake farm no less than 3 times, and each time he was unsuccessful, which is quite ironic when you consider here's the man that's most responsible for the acquisition of millions and millions of acres of national park lands and forest reservations. And so I'm basically, in that sense, I feel like I'm making Muir's dream come true by restoring the old farm. And Aldo Leopold, as I mentioned towards the beginning of the program, had the same wish that the Fountain Lake farm be restored back to its original condition and protected and preserved.
Did Muir lay out his plans for restoring the property?
Not in the scientific sense. He wrote it in terms of sort of poetic prose or narrative a number of times that and it's been documented by myself and others, that he did in fact attempt to buy the place at least 3 times, as I mentioned. Throughout the story of my boyhood and youth, he pays reverence to the farm landscape, and we can look at that too for documentation. I might speak also to those of you listening that have worked a little bit in the field of prairie restoration and landscape restoration. The problems with this site are quite common to the sand counties. The biggest plant species problem I have is going to be with black locust, and as I mentioned, when I got there was a thick, dense stand of black locust, and that is a real pest species in the sense that it reproduces vegetatively by roots and other ways, and so you can cut it, and you can herbicide it, and you can do everything you can think of, and the stuff keeps coming back. So that's going to be my main problem on the site. And I did mention that there was a thick stand of red pines there before, and they were planted so thick that really there was no ground layer at all. And so after cutting, and especially in the sand, we found that the site was really weed-free and quite sterile, so it makes for a real nice planting bed in terms of prairie.
We talked about some of the animals that were there when Muir was a boy. Mm-hmm. What about the plants? Any of those left?
Okay. Again, using the story of my boyhood and youth as reference, we can go through the text of that book, and all through it, John Muir mentions plants that grew there when he was living there, plants that were either abundant or rare at the time, and I'm using those to determine, the species composition. And we also are fortunate that in the sand counties there's little prairie remnants and relics still existing that are quite proximate to this site, and so seeds can be collected at those sites, whether they're along railroads or roadsides or old cemeteries or what. But we can also get a feel for what the virgin species composition was, or the native, the original pre-settlement botanical composition was.
This is a statement of yours. Resuscitating land is a complex and intricate undertaking. Our prairie foundation, the deep black mollisols,
prairie soil, yes,
were fed and formed by more than the roots of silphium and bluestem. These soils were enriched by passenger pigeon guano, bison dung, and the bones of old Winnebagos as well. Native landscape restoration efforts must not stop with pretty prairie facades. We must breathe life back into them too. What do you mean by that?
Okay, I think that we're a standard, sort of a type of standard has evolved within the emerging field of landscape restoration ecology that seems to be botanically bent, that we plant prairies back according to the best of our ability in terms of what species were there originally. And oftentimes the botanical facade is accepted as being satisfactory or as being the objective or the goal. And too often the holistic interdependent community is neglected. In other words, you've got botanists, landscape architects, what have you, out there restoring prairies, and they may not have any idea of what, say, the biological requirements of the fauna, whether it be birds, avifauna, or whether it be mammals, small mammals to large mammals, is. And so I would like to see people come together on restoring landscape and put it back in the community sense rather than just putting it back so that it looks something like a close facsimile to what a prairie must have looked like. And beyond that, then, I think that we have to recognize that there are certain components of the original pre-settlement landscape that are forever gone, and that's a lesson that we must never forget. And that's why I do mention in that text about passenger pigeon guano, which is basically the excrement from passenger pigeons. And when they would roost, say, out in the bur oak trees and the big shagbark hickories out on the central sands savannas, just the density of those birds and the excrement that they would leave on the soil certainly was a real component to or element to those mollisols, or in this case, the sandy loam prairie soils. Then, as far as the buffalo dung, yes, indeed, the buffalo was certainly a member of the native fauna of the prairie, and that's, of course, gone. And as are the Winnebago Indians, were also certainly a part of the native fauna of the prairie landscape. And so those components are gone. There's nothing we can do about that. So we just have to, we settle then at some level for something less than the original.
So how can you satisfy what you're calling for, which is this need to restore in a way from the bottom up rather than from the top down, when the original complexity of those foundation materials can't be recovered?
You, as I said, you just have to do the best you can with what's left. There's still, I suppose it's just it's a matter of degrees in terms of how puritanical you want to be in this whole thing, but there's still a great deal of value to human beings restoring the earth. I prefer, I'll go on to say that
But doesn't it just all keep changing anyway? I mean, don't we have different layers of what would be taking the place now of the passenger pigeon dung and the bison dung and the Winnebago bones? I mean, we have the whole stratum of civilization and culture just keeps adding new layers. What difference does it make?
To begin with, nature certainly is not a static phenomenon. It's very dynamic. It's constantly in what I call sort of a dynamic equilibrium, or a flux, or a process of change. The prairie, of course, being a fire-dependent community, requires stewardship after planting, and fire certainly is probably the primary management tool after, I should say, stewardship tool after the planting, the initial planting. Your question about what replaces the passenger pigeon and the Winnebago bones and all that, I don't know whether the starling guano now replaces the passenger pigeon, or who's to say. I don't think that's quite as important, though, as, in other words, my text was written in a romantic sort of way, and just a way to emphasize that we can't forget that some of these things are gone forever. To finish, though, I think that I want to make this clear that it's very. I can't think of anything more noble for human beings to do than to restore the earth. There's something very beautiful in seeing human hands scatter prairie seeds on an open field. Certainly the human hand has been responsible for the majority of destruction on this earth, so now we've finally gotten to the point where those same human hands are out there restoring the earth, and I think that there's just nothing finer than that.
That's what I was looking for. Thank you. Let's take a caller from Monona.
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Oh. I am 75 years old, and I occasionally cannot recall my friendly good words, so you'll have to put up with that. But to hear
Yes, I am.
To hear you ask whether Leopold was not the first great conservationist just galls me. I've heard for weeks and weeks and months now this year all about Aldo Leopold. I took courses under him, and I liked him after a fashion. However, he was a great hunter, and he was a greater politician. I will admit that his Sand County Almanac is one of the greatest books I've ever read. I think it's just marvelous. But at the same time that Leopold was teaching in the ag school there, the zoo department was quite interested, of course, in what he was doing. In fact, my friendly professor, Professor Noland, asked me if I wouldn't like to take a course, and I said I would. So I did. And now people like Professor Nolan, Professor Wagner, and Professor Emeritus still living, Hostler, were as great conservationists as Leopold ever was. And John Muir, I think, is one of the greatest. I've visited all the places in Wisconsin and many in California connected with Muir. I just felt that someone ought to stand up and say Muir was not, or Leopold was not the only one. That especially people like Nolan, whom they have named the hall after, and that's all. But he was a great teacher. And then there was Professor Wagner, whom the Milwaukee group of Republicans in the state senate at the time used to call the Red Professor. I don't know if you remember that era or not, but he was hounded all the time, and it just flushed like water off his back. He would keep teaching us beautiful courses in evolution, and I think they should get some credit too.
I thank you for your call, and I suspect that Erik Brynildson will not really disagree with what you have to say.
I agree completely. And using Norman Fassett as an example, who was a colleague of Leopold's, who Leopold really credited with his learning about ecology. He admitted that Fassett actually was probably a better, especially field ecologist than Leopold was, and they were close friends, and Fassett influenced Leopold a great deal in terms of his ecological awareness. As far as the other names you mentioned, I'm familiar with all of those. My father and one uncle studied here under Leopold, and some of the others that you mentioned. And I think the difference in terms of their fame, their lack of fame versus Leopold's, is Sand County Almanac. They simply did not, whether it be a gift or what, they didn't write a book of that sort of eloquence and magnitude. It is a classic. And
I think we have to give them all credit due for that Sand County Almanac.
Absolutely.
That is a great book. That is.
I think you're absolutely right, though, in pointing this out. I think there's a lot of people that are unsung and unheralded. And I think that the gift of the pen oftentimes is the difference.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for calling. Isn't it true that great ideas, although individuals are often credited with them, using the principle of synchronicity, if they're really great ideas, they're around. There's a kind of climate for them. And sometimes one person is more receptive to that idea, or in its transmission, it becomes more eloquent, and therefore it ultimately gets credited for it.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
But there's a good foundation that usually precedes its emergence that way.
I agree, Jane. We also have to recognize the periods when these people lived, the issues that were at the forefront. It's things today simply are much more complex and a lot different, and it's much more, I think, difficult for an individual conservationist to make a significant difference than it was even 40 years ago when at the time of Leopold.
Okay, let's take another caller. Poplar, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to thank the gentleman today for sharing with everyone over the air, and just make a comment about something he mentioned earlier. The mystical quality about John Muir. I think this is one of the things that sets him apart from a lot of other great conservationists. I know with myself, I had spent a lot of time in the woods even as a child, and I always had special feelings towards it, but almost felt a little strange about him sometimes, like no one else felt
all of these, even the words that he uses to describe his situations in time and nature goes beyond just the mere words. There's such a feeling brought about that I think that's what separates him from many of the just conservationists. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would agree with that, too.
Eric, we're out of time.
Can I give one last? I would like to urge listeners, if they would, to drop a note if you're behind what I'm doing and the project and the goal is to turn Fountain Lake Farm into a National Historic Site. Please don't hesitate to drop Spencer Black, Jim Moody, Bob Kastenmeyer a note saying that. Thank you.
Thanks. Erik Brynildson is a landscape architect who is restoring the boyhood property farm of John Muir.